Hi, I am Madeline James, and in this video I am interviewing my friend Chris to talk about sword fighting and world building, and the topics that are in this part 1 of the interview are the historical basis for talking about all of this, clothes for fighting or for the military, legality, morality, and honor, and weapon choice and the role of fighting in society. Let's get into it. This is Chris.
Hello, I'm Chris. I am one of Maddie's sword fighting instructors and general giant nerd.
That about sums it up?
Yep.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about world building in sword fighting and using sword fighting in novels and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So
I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is just how much all aspects of culture build directly into the way sword fighting happens. Your clothes make a difference. The materials you have make a difference. Religious practices make a difference. Cultural norms, they all have some effect on how sword fighting is done, who gets to do it, why you do it, what way it's done, like the styles of fighting are affected by all of these things.
right.
And that's not like conjecture, that is things we have written down.
Right.
And so we see these in, I can only speak really from a European perspective because that's most of what I've studied, but that all has that built in. And we see that in the extant sword fighting manuals from 1400 to now.
Right. Which is a pretty common period to go with, unless someone's going like Romanesque or something, but there's
Or
plenty
like
for that too.
Early Middle Ages.
Yeah, you see
that's
that
a little
too.
bit more conjecture. Viking stuff always filled with horrific conjecture. We do still need to sort out when we look at sources that are not primary. Reenactorisms are a big thing.
Yeah.
If we go in scholarly works in like the 60s and 70s, there's also a lot of nonsense.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of nonsense in most topics around that time.
Yeah, so we get like the actual primary sources. If we take something like greatswords, which is kind of my thing a little bit, and we look at that in the manuals of the day, and then we look at some of the primary sources we have leading up to the Victorian era, and then we have what's written in the Victorian era, and we even have like the earliest versions of HEMA, historical European martial arts, which is sort of reconstructed from the manuals. We see Victorians do that already. So we have a sword master from the 1800s who's reconstructing 1600s era greatsword. And it's so bad.
I can only imagine seeing the historical clothing reenactors, like how they paint previous eras and how not historically accurate all of those drawings are, because a lot of the, I guess, pictures and drawings I've seen around in diagrams of like earlier eras of clothing, especially like Italian Quattrocento and stuff like that, is all Victorian drawings, and they're awful.
And Victorian sensibilities. It's the same way we have this sort of like now media-based idea of the Middle Ages having a weird gray-blue filter across it. And it all being dark and colorless and dull.
The Dark Ages.
When they really weren't.
Yeah.
If you look at like the Landsknechts as an example, brightly colored. Bright colors, power clashing, like
right.
materials that were inherently, I think, a little silly at times to have in your clothes if you're marching. Like, I don't know why you need velvet pants.
Yeah.
If you're marching for months at a time on campaign, but the clothing had a different purpose. So much of what we do now is fast fashion, and so much of what we do now is not meant to last, whereas for the Landsknechts, it was a financial investment. They used silver and gold thread, and I don't mean colored, I do mean made of metal.
That's crazy.
Coated threads to make their clothes be like a bank account.
Huh.
Like, we had sumptuary laws in Germany at the time. that did not allow certain amounts of money to be spent on clothes and jewelry and all of these things, because it was the Reformation. So again, we're getting back into the sort of the religious norms of the time were like jet black, like long pants. You didn't show your calves. You're
far too sexy.
Yes. We hang out with dancers and sword fighters. It's also true. But also, like, they didn't allow that. There was rules on how much money you could put on in jewelry at any given time. Like, you weren't allowed to leave your house with more than, I think, at some points in some cities, given that Germany was not a monolith, etc., like 6 gulden worth of pearls. Now, that's a month and a half salary for, like, normal people who had good jobs. So, like, yeah, that'd be the equivalent of walking out of your house now with multiple grand worth of money in jewelry on you. But that was frowned upon now because it's kind of a bad idea unless you're going somewhere safe. Yeah. But then it was genuinely just not culturally acceptable. And there was a direct clash between civilian, secular wants and needs and religious requirements.
Right.
For example, the Weavers Guild had a huge problem with some of these sumptuary laws because it's how they made money. Ostentatious clothing is expensive. And so there's the old reenactorism that Landsknecht Pluderhosen were 100 L's of cloth, and an L is like, depending on where you are and at what time, somewhere between 20 and 30 inches.
Okay.
So, like, you're still talking, like, 30 to 40 yards of cloth.
Which is a lot.
Which is insane. And the reality is it's not. But the reality is it's not that much less. It's half that. It's still 50 L's in some cases. So you're still talking one set of pants made with 15 yards of cloth, which is an insane amount of material.
I don't even know how you do that.
It's layered. You'd cut it and you'd put stuff through and
it
would spill out of your pants. And in one of our swordmasters' times, Joachim Meyer, Southern Germany, 1550s, 60s, 70s, they said that the pants would stop at the knee and fall down and hit the ankle. Right? That's how much poof they just had, and just how much extra bullshit was attached to their pants. Right?
Yeah.
And these were considered ridiculous and ostentatious displays of wealth. And that was then frowned upon extra because it's ostentatious displays of wealth based on killing people because they were mercenaries and their job was to serve in the imperial army when they were being paid for that. So it was also like the spoils of your enemies that was used to pay for these pants. So they were banned in some cities. Like, some cities did not allow you to enter the front gates in these pants because they were too ridiculous.
Illegal pants.
Yeah, and so not only were you not allowed to go into the city with them, you weren't allowed to have them made either. Until the Weavers Guild got really upset about this, because one pair of pants is like a year's salary type of money. And so they, requested from the government that they could do that, and they were given a special dispensation that they could be made in the city, but not worn in the city. So you could go in and get a pair tailored for yourself, and then you just like pop them in a bag and hide them and walk out,
It's like buying a sword at the Renaissance Festival.
A little bit. And so, like, we have all these competing cultural elements that also define whether or not sword fighting is okay, whether or not being someone who knows how to fight is okay.
Right.
And we see this back and forth between civilian clothing and military clothing and who influences who based on the political status of the military and in which country and what time period. Stibbert there's a museum in Florence, the Museo Stibbert, which was founded by A. Stibbert,
right.
Who was the grandson of the governor of Bengal, served under Garibaldi in Italy during the Unification Wars, but was a British soldier.
Okay.
He fell in love with a Florentine woman, bought 2 villas just outside of Florence at the time. They're now inside Florence, but outside the city walls. Connected them and made them his own personal, like, military hoarding museum. It is the coolest museum. It's weird, though. But his research that he's written on and what he was doing at the time was comparing military and civilian clothing.
Okay.
Right? So when we see the military move towards peace cod chest plates, sort of come in together in the little point, and they're sort of circular, but they come out to like a ridge.
Yeah.
We also saw the same silhouette in clothing for the civilians, a little bit like shifted in time.
Okay.
But then that's right after the wars in Italy where the military was in good standing.
Right.
And that was
so they want to emulate that.
Whereas then it goes the other way. And military clothing is more practical. Often more practical. There are no absolutes.
We've already discussed many.
So, like, it was one of those things where the clothing goes back and forth, which means the way you wore your sword changed, or whether or not wearing a sword was cool kind of changed. And so you have eras where, like, you didn't really wear a sword outside. But then there were eras where you're not allowed to wear a sword outside. Or in some parts of Spain, you weren't allowed to have a sword past a certain length. Namely, from shoulder on one side to tip of finger on the other.
Okay.
That's how long your sword's allowed to be. Now, I'm a big guy, right? And
Yeah.
so even for me, that is shorter than my current practice longsword.
Right, yeah.
Right? That is... My draw length for a bow is like 35 inches.
Right.
So that's... And my longsword is, what, 51? Which is excessive and not entirely accurate, but it's for sport, etc.
It's fun.
So then we also have to take that into account when we're looking at world building. Is the clothing something that allows fighting? Is the clothing something that's protective? If I'm wearing, because it's the norm, an undershirt with an overshirt, with a vest, with a cloak, with a jacket, I can almost block off light sword cuts with my clothing.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, enough layers of like linen fabrics and well-weaved fabrics like that will
hold off something. Won't hold off direct anything, and it won't hold off against a slicing action. But it's enough that if you're doing something like rapier fencing, you can hand parry.
Right.
Or sleeve parry.
And they still use that in the SCA right now for dueling. For certain types of clothing, it can be certain layers of linen.
Yes.
And they'll do cut tests.
Yes.
To see if that's enough to protect you.
Yeah, absolutely. The SCA has done some very interesting work when it comes to this kind of stuff. As much as a HEMA person, we mock the SCA for a variety of reasons. Most of that is just in good fun. It's not entirely accurate. They do a lot of good stuff.
Yeah. The drop tests are a little weird, though.
The flex tests,
yeah.
Honestly, depending on who you talk to, they're more accurate than a lot of the ways we do flex for HEMA swords.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, because we don't take into account the weight of the weapon. Right? Okay. So we just take our weapon and push it on a scale. Like, that's one of the common ones. Or we vice it and then put a weight on it.
Right.
Castile Armory was one of the biggest American makers for HEMA swords recently, like in the last 3 days. Had a big thread on their Facebook group about how do we define flex and what are we doing, and is any of it standardizable or whatever. And the answer is not really.
Yeah. I mean,
and the SCA version works.
Yeah.
Right? It works just as well as the rest of our versions. Well, the big problem is we don't have like crossover. We don't really have like, if the SCA says it's this level and the HEMA version says it's this level, these do coincide.
Yeah. And there'll be different marks and like different sword manufacturers that's like, yes, this is SCA compliant for these types of things and HEMA compliant for these things, because all of that.
And all of it, and this is a complete aside, is completely ridiculous and stiff compared to a lot of historical weapons.
Yeah. There's
a German fencing manual, I think Anton Kahn, I want to say 1850s?
Okay.
It's either the 1850s or the 1750s. Like, the first saber manual in Germany is like 17 and whatever, but I can't remember which one Kahn is. And he says you should be able to take the tip of your saber and bend it 9 inches closer to the bell, let go, and it should still be perfectly straight. But that is a lot of bend.
Yeah.
Right? So these things are all there. Godinho, who we studied together for Two Swords, states that, everyone wears a cloak. But if you're going to go out at night and you know something bad's going to happen, and you know that you're either going to get attacked or you're going out to attack someone, you don't bring your cloak or your hat, because they're personalized, customizable items that in the middle of a sword fight will fall to the ground, or you have to take it off because you're not going to use it. It's cumbersome. And if you have to run away from the cops, you don't want to leave like a calling card. So he specifically says, if you're going out at night with this as a thought process, don't wear your cloak.
So if you see someone without a cloak on, turn the other way.
They might be sketchy, or they might be broke. One of the two.
Yeah.
Or, both of those things. So like that's one of those things. So we see these manuals that have these like little tidbits.
Mm-hmm.
And like everyone looks at manuals and wants to read the sword fighting part. And honestly, I think that's often the least important and the least interesting part of a manual. The introduction sections are ridiculous. And the best part is just listening to masters shit talk other masters.
Yeah. The drama.
It's funny. Or like even like national conflict, like the Italians will mock the Germans and the Germans will mock the French, and it's all in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so when you're talking about world building, you have to figure out whether the religion at the time allows and is okay with that.
Right.
Whether they have sort of weird rules about spilling blood versus blunt force trauma. You get some people talking about that with monks and whatever, and I don't know how accurate that is. But like, that's a thing.
Right.
At the same time, you have the Reformation, and they were not anti-violence, and neither were the Catholics, really. To the point that if you go to the armory in the palace in Dresden in Germany, you can see Martin Luther's house sword. It's labeled that.
Yeah.
It's his home self-defense sword. And it's a falchion, and it's big, and it's meaty, and like you take an arm off with it.
That's great.
But it's Martin Luther's.
Yeah.
So like, clearly, he didn't have a huge problem with the potential need for violence.
Right.
And we also have to look at it with social norms that are different from our own. Like, we have a lot less acceptance of violence as a concept in everyday life.
Yeah.
In sort of our modern setting. Whereas, like, you go back a little further and you start to see it be more of a norm.
Right.
Have you heard of Bartitsu?
No.
Bartitsu is the martial art that, what's his name? Now I'm blanking on his name. Sherlock Holmes used.
Oh, okay.
Created by a guy named Barton.
Okay.
Who decided to name it after himself. And it's a combination of Irish pugilism, cane fighting, and some Eastern martial arts.
Okay.
And so that's why I call it Bartitsu. And it was created for the purposes of people with money in London being able to defend themselves while wearing a three-piece suit.
Right.
Because at the time, London was being taken over by gangs, and being mugged on the way home was like part of life.
Right, so you had to be prepared for it.
But you have a cane, so you learn how to clock someone with it, and you learn how to box, and you learn how to kick, and you learn all these things that are meant for self-defense in a setting where physical violence is commonplace.
Right. Right, so you have to consider both, you know, what is accepted and what isn't for people to know and learn how to do, and then also just what kind of dangers they might have to defend against in different scenarios. Yeah.
And what is if you're building about like an urban environment or travel between urban environments, is it like we often hear like the bandit trope is like a big thing.
Yeah.
It's a great way to move things along.
Yeah.
But also in some parts of the world, it's true. It was a thing that traveling from city to city was dangerous, especially outside of more centrally controlled regional militaries, like in a big empire type setting.
Right.
When you like think of Rome, and they had like militaries walking around, and you had patrols, and there was a much more organized form of that than say between feudal kingdoms that are not organized in
the hinterlands and all.
Yeah, or even like not if you're in the hinterlands, but if you're looking at sort of an unstructured space around what is now Germany before the empire, after the empire, like there's differences in what's policed along the way.
Right.
Whether or not the guy cares what happens across the border with the other princedom, or if he actively is encouraging nonsense. So the politics starts to fall into it too, and the way the countries are, or the countries is probably too modern, but like whatever nations.
The very polities and stuff.
Yeah. And then that builds back into the economics of the area. The more poor people are, the more they'll have to commit crime to provide for themselves and their families and that kind of thing. That's a standard thing we see throughout the world.
Yeah.
Industrialization plays a part in that.
Yeah.
There's a book that is very niche. I don't think most people would enjoy it, but it is The Travel Journals of Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin's, who was looking at geographical evolution.
Okay.
Doesn't sound like it belongs with this, but bear with me. At one point, he is laid up with basically trench foot.
Okay.
Because he got it was raining. He was traveling between sort of Papua New Guinea kind of space and the archipelagos leading back up to China, and he got becalmed, but it was raining, so he was always wet, and he couldn't take off and clean and dry. So he got nasty infection in his feet. When they got to where they were going, he had to be laid up. He was stuck in bed for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
In a group of people who did not have written laws, did not have centralized government, where the community did all of this in a very unspoken way.
Right.
And he comments on this on a very typical English naturalist, casual racism kind of way.
Yeah. As they do.
So the language used is rough by modern standards. It's a very noble savage kind of idea. But he goes, why do these people have this much community and lack of crime and all this when they don't have a legal system?
Right.
They just have an understanding. And if someone breaks that understanding, they get cast out of the village, and that's a death sentence.
Yeah.
Because community is required for life.
Yeah.
He's like, but then back home, we just had the Industrial Revolution, and you would think that with progress, and you'd think that with more modernization, and the ability to do more work, and separations of labor, and all these things, we'd also advance as a society. And he goes, no, that's not what we see. We see people get poorer. We see people who are rich make more money, and which is a common refrain forever.
Yeah.
But he comments on this in sort of but that means more people are committing crime, and we are seeing the creation of a sub-lower class, and all these things. And so even just where you're writing about space within that sort of pre-industrialization, industrial revolution, whatever, comes into play, also affects crime and the need to defend oneself, and all of what we were talking about just now with Bartitsu.
Yeah.
So those are all there. And it's all interesting to me because we then also see things that fall into cultural norms about how one should fight.
Right, right.
With different groups being more or less pragmatic. There is some sort of discussions of honor in some things, which is more a dueling concept than a military one.
Right.
But then we do see rules of engagement approaches in certain civilizations.
Right.
Whereas you don't see that in other civilizations. You fight to win because it's not about honor. It's about not getting your country destroyed or taken over by the weirdos next door. You know?
Yeah. I don't remember where it's from, but one of the things I read that was surprising was that, I can't remember which period it was or where it was. I think it's relatively central, but it was that a lot of the times in battle, they wouldn't actually kill that many people. They would just take a lot of hostages. They would exchange money for paying for the hostages, and it wasn't as much about actually gaining that sort of defeat of the enemy, and was more just about the money side of it.
But taking the enemy's money is defeating the enemy.
Well,
right?
yeah, but not through army, battle through, I guess,
attrition of cash. On some level, it causes civilian unrest if you keep taxing them to pay for nobles getting captured all the time.
Right.
We see that a lot in the way knights were dealt with, in that there were rules between nobles. That there was some sort of levels of rules of engagement between knights who were part of a higher class.
Right.
And you don't kill them, you hold on to them, and you ransom them, or you can even ransom their armor.
Yeah.
Because armor is expensive. It's one thing to send the dude back, but you're not giving him his hyper expensive fancy armor. You hold on to that.
Yeah.
Or you ransom that separately. Or you ransom, or you killed the guy, but you can still ransom his armor back to his family because some of them are heirlooms.
Less likely to murder you on the way back.
Right. To the point where we also see that in the sort of rules of engagement that were often broken by Americans during the Revolutionary War, where you don't kill officers. So there's some level of the Brits not fully understanding why their officers are just getting shot right at the offset of fight, which is pragmatic on one level for you to do, as to take down the organizational structure of the enemy, but also was just not cool, bro. They touch on that a little bit in, is it The Patriot? The Mel Gibson movie?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. I think
that's the one.
I think? Maybe.
And they do it a little bit more I don't know if that's entirely like an accurate thing to go off of, but
just
like,
but
conceptually,
dramatization.
Yes.
Dramatization. That's the word I'm looking for.
So like but it's still a concept
right.
on some level to ransom back officers more than just bums who are cannon fodder.
Yeah.
Even their private and personal materials are part of that.
Yeah.
Memoirs, journals, whatever, because those were considered important and useful. But then we also just see other weird cultural norms come into it.
Okay.
So in Germany, let me take a step back.
Okay. We
hear a lot of discussion about dueling versus military. Particularly we hear that in HEMA, but dueling swords versus military weapons versus dueling systems versus military systems. It's nonsense. It's just no difference.
Okay.
You're not going to, as a swords person, learn two systems, one to use in dueling and one to use in combat.
Right.
That's silly.
Okay.
Part of this comes from a book that was published that was one of the first Italian saber sources that was published in English, where the publisher forced the dueling name into the title, but the author didn't want it, is what I've been told. There is no dueling language like that in the actual Italian, is my understanding. I don't read Italian. I can't tell you if that's true, but that's what I've been told by people who study the works. The one place that has some truth to it in Germany is that we have academic fencing and we have military fencing.
Right.
So in Germany, you have Mensur. There's a very long tradition until it was banned by the Nazis and then brought back in the 70s, where the aim is to cut the other person across the face, but just enough to give them a cool scar, not enough to like punch through their cheek.
Okay.
Right, which is why if you were to look at like a book of images of Nazi officers, most of them have facial scars.
Okay.
Because most of them went to university, and at university we see academic fencing where they cut each other in the face.
Interesting.
It's also kind of where we get those like cast iron steampunk goggles from.
Oh.
Because the only place you're allowed to hit them is the face.
Right.
So you wear like chain and Gambison style protection around your body. They had huge wicker baskets as the hand protection.
Yeah.
And it's fought kind of like a single stick fight where you're in measure, you're from high, and you're just beating on each until someone gets cut. You'd lose eyes because you're aiming at the face.
Yeah.
So they started making these like big cast iron goggles that were meant to like just protect you from
just the eyeballs.
Yeah, just from a cut going across the face to not take your eye out.
That's great. And
these were done with what we would call Burschenschaften in German, which is kind of like a fraternity.
Okay.
But they were not like a specific to like the more specific fraternities we see now. This wasn't like a fencing fraternity. It was a fraternity, and you also fought.
Right.
And then like fraternities would meet in the woods, like 200 people on either side, and like tables full of food, and they would just go at it for fun.
Cut each other's faces.
Named like with written out duels and like, you know, like actual things. It was bad form not to bring a doctor or at least a med student kind of deal, to make sure no one died.
Right.
Because it was sort of frowned upon, sort of not. And there were rules. We have what are called Sauhiebe in German, which translates to swine cuts, which you have to be a swine, like as a person, like a bad person, to do this in a duel. And there are certain cuts that you're just not allowed to do because they go to somewhere that's unprotected but isn't part of the fight, that kind of thing. A lot of it is cuts below the waist.
Right.
Because that, you know...
If you're aiming up here... And...
If the aim is to go up here, someone's not defending low, and you're just cutting them across the thighs or across the shins to be a jerk, you can do a lot of serious damage to someone on a permanent level, and that's a problem.
Right.
So in Mensur, we're aiming for faces.
Yeah.
If you look at military manuals at the same time, or just other fencing manuals at the same time, whether they label themselves for military use or not, my favorite manual, which is 1838, F.C. Christman. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of English translations of this. There's one for like the first third of the book that a colleague I have is working on the rest.
Okay.
Talks about how he's going to teach you these things. Because it is not about honor. It is not about dueling. It's about winning a fight on a battlefield where it doesn't matter how you win. What matters is that you win.
Right.
So if you have like sensitivities about this, go somewhere else.
Right.
Which is like, yeah, no, fair enough. If you're here to learn how to fight the guy next door because he hit on your wife, that is a different system than, or concept behind the fencing than if you are going to kill the French.
Right. Yeah.
No, it's 1838. It's post-Napoleon. So like, the French are the bad guys.
Yeah.
Although the next big thing will be the Danes in history.
Right.
So that's sort of other things we see culturally. What I touched on about religion is also in this book. So F.C. Christman was part of the movement that's muscular Christianity.
Right.
Which is hilarious and bizarre and a very strange movement. But it comes at the same time that in Germany, they were also thinking about how the reason they won the Napoleonic Wars, and there was the beginnings of like exercise culture and fitness culture in Germany at the time with the Turner, sort of centered around Frankfurt and other places. And I mentioned to you this before, but I think it's so funny. Christman has 4 reasons to fence. 4 reasons to learn how to sword fight.
Right.
And notably, this is military. The man was an officer. He fought, and he fought under Napoleon, which is awkward. He's German. So he didn't go straight home. He went through Italy and learned Italian Bolognese fencing with saber.
Oh, okay.
And then went back to Germany and mixed German military and academic fencing, and sort of made his own book.
Okay.
After becoming a professor of the fencing arts at the local university.
Fancy.
Huge nerd. My people. And it's written very academically.
Yeah.
Very academically. But 4 reasons to learn how to fence. 1 is to look pretty. It's an aesthetically positive choice to learn how to fence.
Right.
And that is important because as we are crafted in the image of God, we should strive to be godly in our image, and therefore looking pretty is important.
Right.
Which is a hilarious thing to write in a military training manual.
It's distinctive.
It's very memorable. It's one of those things where like a lot of manuals have like 1 or 2 things, but this one is just hilarious through and through. The second one is that it's good for your health. It's a personal benefit.
Right.
It improves my health. It improves my ability to do what I need to do as a citizen, as a person with duties to country and family and all of these things.
Right.
So so you look good.
Yeah.
You're healthy. The third one is community and creation and support of community in a sort of like entertainment sense, because exhibition matches are fun and showing off your ability to fence for your community is a fun sort of afternoon thing that you can do. And he suggests these things as a positive that everyone should do. And as a way to encourage people to learn how to fence. So he comments that he thinks that a lot of countries in Europe have lost sort of a positive approach to the military and training in general. And he thinks the Germans still do that well. And if your community is built around some of this, it'll encourage younger generations to carry on that tradition and learn how to fight and keep that as part of culture. And then fourthly is to defend yourself, defend your country, and defend your loved ones. And it is in that order.
Which, priorities. Priorities say a lot about a people.
It does, and I don't know how much of that is a reflection on cultural shift in Germany, because we are seeing a shift away from the sort of military stuff in Germany at the time, in some ways, and moving towards a shift towards more civilian things like exercise. But what's also interesting about Christman is that while he's trying to support that and build that culture and keep it and maintain those traditions, he suggests learning other disciplines as well. My niche in HEMA has been the dance sword crossover stuff.
Yeah.
Biomechanically, footwork, movement, just knowing your body, etc. Christman agrees.
Okay.
He says there are 11 physical disciplines one should be aware of before and excel at before one picks up a sword.
Okay.
And number 11 is dancing.
Okay.
So and the most frustrating line written in a manual ever, well, maybe the second most frustrating line is, other people have written about this, so I won't go into it. I don't know if that's true. I haven't found anything written on it. Screw him. He should have given me a whole book on that.
Yeah. Right.
But it's basics. He's like, you should be able to walk long distances. You should be able to run, jump, swim, ride a horse. Voltigieren is one of them, which is pommel horses.
Okay.
Like launching yourself over the pommel horse. It's a skill you should have.
Okay.
It's a cavalry training skill, so that might be part of it. General exercise, gymnastics.
Okay.
Right, and this is a military man stating what other people who want to be military men should be able to do.
Right.
This is inherently a masculine endeavor.
Right.
and a godly endeavor.
Of course.
And it includes gymnastics. Exercising at the time probably a bit more calisthenics-y than heavy weightlifting, because heavy weightlifting is a very modern thing in some level, in the way we do it anyway. And then you should be able to drive a horse-drawn carriage, because it's feeling it, is understanding just from the pressure in your hands of the pull or not whether your horse is going to veer off. And when we talk about feeling in German fencing, that is a big part of it, just being able to feel where the swords are moving or not, depending on the pressure against your blade.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's a skill, that's a transferable skill that he wants you to learn before you ever learn how to fence, which is why when they don't talk about it at all in fencing manuals, and they just say you should just feel it, you should know, I think there's some level of, well, you're a human being at a time frame of a certain social class who got a sword. These are all things you should have in your back pocket already. They are fundamental to, as my mother would call it, the skills of a good European gentleman.
So clearly we should get some horse-drawn carts for our next HEMA practice.
You know, I'm so here for it. Everyone's so mad about the New York horse-drawn carriages things. Let's bring them into the fencing salles instead and learn how to do that.
We'll take them on.
Right? So all these things are part of what you should learn. And so there's sort of physical fundamental baseline that is spoken in this manual. Very unspoken in other ones. Right. And I think that's part of our difficulty in interpretation, is also there's just a different baseline of knowledge. And that's something else you have to bring into your world building. Is this a culture that has a physical culture built into it? Right. You see cultures that do, and you see cultures that don't. And you have cultures with a caste separation, depending on, or a class separation, which then also plays into what weapons we choose. Yeah. Right. So we have I focus on the German because I'm a German citizen and I speak German. I can read the books in the original. So that's why that's the focus. Yeah. But we have something called Bauernwehr, which is farming arms. Okay. And so we see manuals that are focused on how to use a pitchfork, how to use a sickle, how to use a scythe. Now the Poles had war scythes, where you took the blade and you turned it in line, so it was like in line with the thing. But you also see some where it's like, here's how you fight with a normal scythe. Sickle fighting, which we see separately in things like Silat and other Asian martial arts, where they also use sickle blades. And I would imagine it has some of the same connotation of, well, you have these lying around, and if you're going to get called to war, it's not like anyone's providing you with a sword. Right, that's but also, expensive. You're a farmer. When was the last time you had a sword, and when did you have the time to train with it? Right. Yeah, because you think that these are weapons and things that they're used to the weight of and holding them and maintaining them. And understanding how they move. And understanding how you have to move your body to make them effective. We talk about edge alignment in sword fighting, that you have to get a clean cut with the edge alignment. If you do it the wrong way, your sword will bend funny when it hits things. So they'll know that. They'll have the muscles to do that already. Yeah, and just that knowledge. Like, using a scythe is a learned skill. Because the blade is on a curve and on a diagonal. Right. So you have to have it so that it takes that. Otherwise, you're just pushing blades of grass down. Right. I did once have to use a scythe on my yard. Because it got past the point where I could use a lawnmower because I was just moving in and it had been let to grow. And obviously I asked HEMA people, does someone have a scythe? And someone did, so I scythed in my backyard. That's great. It's very quick. It is very efficient if you do it well. And even with mine, where it was a scythe built for someone like 1.5 foot shorter than me, it still worked. I mean, I had a crick in my back from leaning over to use it, but other than that, you get the alignment right. It's quite easy. Okay. But again, it's something you have to know. Right. And a lot of scythes don't have like a sharp point in the same way one might expect, because there's like a heavy edge along the back to maintain stiffness. Right. The very specific fighting styles to adapt that. Yeah. 100%. You'd have to. So class and caste and all of that. So you have a lot of discussion. It's a common trope that I think is built from some historical stuff with, like I said before, religious orders not being allowed to cut people. Right. Okay. As if that was somehow less lethal if you use a 6-foot quarterstaff that has an iron foot on the top of it and you collapse someone's skull. Like, apparently blood is bad. I don't know. It makes no sense. I don't know. You bleed pretty good. You got conked in the head with one of those. Yeah, well. And that's another fun misconception. So I'm going to hop off on that for a second.
Okay.
Polearm fencing, staff fencing in particular, baton fencing is very common in a lot of countries because everyone has a stick. It's not just us as children walking around picking up sticks and pretending they're swords. A lot of sticks were used as pre-sword training,
right,
or as military training for civilians. In Egypt, we have tahtib, which ostensibly has 5,000 years of history of just 4-foot sticks and beating people with them.
Yeah.
That is currently being recreated in a modern setting. Modern tahtib is a thing, but we have hieroglyphs on pyramids that discuss how these are used. And we have a living tradition in parts of rural Egypt still of stick fighting.
Right.
But we see stick fighting in most cultures just because it's practical.
Right. There's sticks everywhere.
Again, my fencing manual that I really enjoy from the 1830s also has a natural weapons section at the back.
Okay.
Which is a sort of, we know you know how to fence, but sometimes you don't have your sword on you.
Right.
So pick up a stick off the side of the road, beat him to death. But do it well.
Right.
Smartly.
Yeah.
And we see single stick fencing as a precursor to saber and broadsword fencing in the UK, and that kind of thing. But there's this common misconception when we talk about quarterstaff fighting in particular, that it's all like a third in and a third in, and it's like all this stuff. Meyer, which is a German source from the 1650s, starts polearms with grab the bottom, grab a third up, lift it up high, and then use your whole body to slam it down on people.
Right.
Right? And so we also see that in a lot of staff fighting, that you start here, and then as you bring it down, it's like an axe, you slide to the bottom so you have maximum leverage.
Yeah.
And we've done that with pine, which doesn't weigh anything.
Right.
And if you do it hard enough, you will shatter your staff across the floor if you hit the ground. Right? So when you see like exhibition for Chinese martial arts and other Asian martial arts, you see them hit the ground a lot, you'll see that flex.
Yeah.
Because they're using wood that's meant for that.
Right.
But if you're trying to kill somebody, you don't want something that'll bend that much.
Right.
And so you use these, like ash is something that we hear a lot of use in oak, and that will just break things. It'll break swords if you use it correctly and get them at the right angle. It'll collapse sections of armor, and if you are someone who fights in armor, you know that if a section of it collapses in on you a little bit, like it really restricts your movement.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. So like, even lower class and lower caste, if that's something that the culture uses, they're also very effective non-bladed weaponry. Because in the end, a 5-foot lever is a 5-foot lever.
Right. Yeah, and if you know how to use it.
And wood's not light.
Yeah.
Unless you choose a particularly light wood.
Right.